it does seem like there's been something of a sort of second renaissance of anatomy. Like there was this, the time when people didn't know what was going on in the human body and you weren't allowed to cut it up. And then in the Renaissance, maybe people started to go, well, what is inside? And, other cultures hadn't done that so much. There was Indian cultures.
It was taboo.
It was taboo. It was illegal, right? And then it was kind of, some was loosened and they had to dig up graves and things. And then they were like, look, there's this thing. It's not what is in your imagination. The reality is this. And then there was this sort of period of a few hundred years where people go, okay, we've done that. We know anatomy. And listeners may not realize that stuff still gets discovered or re-looked at freshly. They may have some sense like, didn't we figure that out in the 17th century? Has anything new happened in the last 300 years?
Well, something, it's one of those catchy things that a reporter can write up every year or so. Shocking revelation, new thing discovered in the human body. And everybody's like, how could that be? And it's like, no, really look at this. And it does sell some newspapers or get some web time, but I do feel like it is possible to actually look at the body with fresh eyes. And I think what enabled me to do that was I wasn't taught it, basically. So I just sort of stumbled in out of my own curiosity without having been exposed to regional anatomy, except, through my Rolfing training a little bit, but even that was tweaked by, say, Tom Myers, who I know is part of the conference as well. Mm-hmm. Yep. A very old friend. I've known Tom since 1991, and he started talking about layers, and I was like, layers, that's interesting, and then when I tried to do a little dissection myself, I followed the medical textbook and found myself just hacking it up and disrupting those layers. So I thought, let me redo this. Let's throw out that book and let's just run with the idea of layers and see how the dissection comes out. It came out very profoundly instructional and transformative, just to see it, just to like witness that thing that isn't in any book, and to repeat that process until I could refine it to a degree that it would be continually revelatory. And I continue to learn from the same process. I've done it hundreds of times, and I continue to be like, I see more and more and more. It's like looking into a mist and things, just slowly appear before your eyes when you do it this way.
And yeah, I think it was Pete or Gary telling me they discovered a fifth muscle in the quadriceps, so you can't call them the quadriceps anymore. Really, really quite, what? No one noticed that? No, apparently not. And also in terms of, we've studied dead bodies, right? And we're trying to study this thing which is conscious, moving, alive, after it's been dead and covered in formaldehyde or whatever. Like, that's got to affect people's perception of what anatomy is.
Whatever you show up with the table is, you're sure to see it. And certainly, if you don't give an accounting for the interpretive act of witnessing the dead in order to understand the living, you're missing the boat. So if you won't see much in microscopy if you don't kill and stain stuff, right? So you're going to put that sliver on a slide and you're going to put dye on it, because otherwise you won't see a thing. The light will go through these transparent structures and you'll miss them completely. But when you kill, stain, dye things, then you learn stuff. And it's not dissimilar with the formaldehyde-laden cadaver. Basically, it's like a stained slide. You can see a lot, and it slows down time for you. You have more time to work with the form. But if you don't include, a continuous consciousness around the fact that this is an artifact, and in fact, it's not merely that the cadaver is an artifact and an abstraction of the living form, but every stroke of the scalpel introduces an artifact, right? So you can't dissect without without falsifying it. But if you know that you're falsifying it while you're dissecting it, then you can at least glean, from that process, something, a story that can be told. And it's not dissimilar with our words, which are slicing up reality with every utterance. And at the same time, we speak and learn about our world.
I want to come back to the language thing. That's interesting. It strikes me as almost a process of falsely creating nouns out of a verb. Does that make sense? Like there's something which is a process.
Yeah.
and
Yeah, well, this is very true. That's very true. Yeah, when I put people in front of the table.
Gil, sorry to interrupt. Your internet connection's gone a bit choppy. I don't know if there's anything you can do there. Is it solid, or I think we're good this end?
Hello.
Yeah,
is it choppy still?
Yeah, it's only the visual. The auditory is fine, but it's like you've gone into slow motion visually. We could always just not use.
Oh gosh.
It's quite a strippy effect. You know what? We can always take it and just use it on the podcast because the audio is fine, and we don't have to use it for the YouTube.
Very good. I'm glad the audio works at least.
So you were saying.
So you were talking about sort of nominalizing our moving world, and yeah, I think that's a fair analogy. And I always stand around the table, and try and invite people to recognize what's missing here, right? In other words, and it's stark. You've said you've done dissection. The difference between the living and the dead is stark.
Yeah.
In terms of movement. And so, okay, so I'll say fine, but that doesn't mean you can't learn about a river's path by looking at the bed it formed, right? And there are artifacts of movement in the body that I'm tracking. And it's no different than a footprint, by a good tracker in the woods. He can look at a deer's hoof and the way it hit the mud and tell you something about the size of the animal and the length of its gait. And it's basically, I do consider the work of the anatomist to be that of a tracker. And if it's not, then well, I'm not doing that. But I see it as kind of, look, I'm looking at water's footprints all over the body. And I'm trying to witness the movement of breath and life and fluids that have left this form as its artifact. I don't mistake the artifact for the reality. I don't mistake the model for the reality. I know the reality is much grander. However, from the lens of the artifact, I can learn something about the reality, and I try my best to do so. And then the question is, if it can be integrated into my life, then I'm moving in the right direction.
What do you think are some of the main misunderstandings about anatomy then, like in terms of just the systems of the body, how it works? I mean, just do a bit of myth busting for us here.
Well, even I have a friend who always says, so you're a systems guy. And I'm like, no, not even a systems guy, because even the systems themselves are just concepts that are parsing out aspects of the body which are completely and entirely integrated. I mean, we project so much onto our bodies from our culture. We think in our Piscean hierarchical culture that our brain must be in charge. It must be a supercomputer, or everything else must be following it. It's not the case. It's just more mud in the bucket. In other words, the whole body is constantly working together. There's no real preference in the systems. I mean, you can take out a lot. I mean, I worked on a guy who had half of his brain taken out. He wasn't the worst for wear at the moment. You'd be amazed at what you can get away with on this planet.
That's good news for me, Gil. It's good. I think about half my brain's working right now with the conference, so that's good news. I can manage on half.
Well, I can definitely imagine that the other half is well occupied with that enormous task. So.
There's a lot on, but this, I'm also just getting to speak to, I spoke to Stephen Porges today, who's like one of the big names of anatomy. I spoke to one of my heroes from the sort of British environmental personal growth scene. It's just like fascinating how many people I'm in contact with through this. So
yeah, you're the lucky fella. You get to touch bases with everybody.
It's pretty cool. I get kind of casual about it after a while, but it's certainly a privilege. It's certainly a privilege. But
well, once your mind has been blown like 50 times in a row, what's left to blow? Do you get? Are you jaded with?
It's easy to get a bit arrogant with it, and it's easy to get. How can I say that? Just like casual with. Like, I talk to Zen masters on a daily basis, not just sort of smart people. So it's kind of like I don't know. Like the only slight negative side effect, mostly I'm just in wonder and I'm happy. That's generally my state with it. I'm just like, cool, I get to speak to Gil Hedley. That's generally how I am, and it gives me lots of energy. The only slight disadvantage, I've noticed myself getting a little bored of the mundane, like just normal conversations with sort of, I don't want to be snobby, but kind of like normal people who aren't geeked out on this stuff. So that's the only slight disadvantage I've seen. But then there's another part of me which is quite Taoist and can kind of get into the magic of the normal as well. So that's not too bad a side effect. What about you? Who does it bring you in contact with? I mean, you spend a lot of your time in rooms cutting up dead bodies. I mean, it's kind of an unusual way to spend a life, right? You're doing that, you're teaching. How has it impacted? Let's reverse this. How has it impacted you to spend so much time with cadavers?
I have to say, I've spent more time in this particular year with cadavers than ever in my life, and it's been a continual revelation how little I know, and how after all these years I can be shown up and surprised on a daily basis by what is absolutely mundane. There's little more mundane than specks of flesh in dead bodies, and yet they continue to astound me, surprise me, draw me in, compel me to look closer, to observe more carefully, to reconsider my prejudices, my beliefs, my preferences. It's constantly a revelation, and that surprises the shit out of me, to be perfectly honest, because you'd think it'd be over by now.
Right, it's done by now. There's a humbling quality to getting into anything deeply, because anything just keeps opening up, whether it's wine tasting or aikido or anatomy. I've talked to many people on the podcast who've had a similar experience, and some of them I think are just saying it, because it sounds good. But like, I genuinely believe you and most people who say this, that like, when they get into something deeply, it's humbling because it keeps opening up what they don't know, and it draws. But it strikes me that almost you've chosen the most humbling topic, because
it's literally made of humus. In other words, it's the humble is the earth. I learned that from reading Charlotte's Web long ago. And it is profoundly humbling also to be basically paging through somebody's diary who's passed away and seeing the evidence of a life. And
tell me what you mean by that. That's great. The evidence of a life. Give me a couple of examples. What do you mean?
Well, you're scraping along on a bone trying to make it shiny, and you're like, oh dang, this rib was broken and healed. That was an experience. Somebody felt really badly right there at some point, and now it healed, and they moved through it. And that's remarkable. And oh, look how something is stuck underneath here because of that. Or you're paddling along, everything looks fine, and all of a sudden you run into hardware that it's like, whoa, there was a hard experience there, and then there was this need for surgery, and there were experts who came in, and there was recovery time, and maybe you never fully recovered, and yet the tissue healed over that. And I can't help but think, whoa, these are the footprints of a person, of a life. It's not generic. They're not all the same. And in fact,
bodies are quite different.
This is the essence of integral anatomy, is to start with the specific example rather than the averaged mean, right? And I always say that the mean is kind of mean.
Mean is mean.
The mean is
destroy
mean.
The individuality. You destroy what makes, like, an average of anything is dull.
Yeah, like, and nobody can live up to it. Nobody can even live up to the average, because no body matches it. Literally no body. So I reject the study of nobody as the standard for anatomy.
Nobody is not a good standard, is what you're saying.
It's a terrible starting point. So I would rather start with somebody and then recognize somebody as the absolute 100% perfect example of human anatomy, and to not exclude the next body as another 100% perfect example that's different. And
give so different examples, because this will astound people. I've seen some of these examples, but bodies can be very, very different, can't they?
Well, just look off one face to another, one person in a supermarket to another. We're all quite different, and then somehow we expect the insides to be exactly the same, and yet they're as unique. The physiognomy is no more representative of our uniqueness than is your liver, or one vertebrae in your spine, or one pair of ribs twisting around each other, and are utterly unique. And I was so shocked last year, or 2 years ago, I don't remember the first time I did it, when I decided, to run a class, an extended length of class and to include as part of the class a commitment to skeletonization. So to not open any of the joints. And we worked with unfixed tissues and used a lot of ice to make them last longer so that we could have movable joints in these 4 bodies. And so we went on the course of 10 days from an entire human form to their skeletons. And we still knew them and could recognize them instantly just looking at their skeletons. Not because their skeletons look so much like their bodies, they look very different, but because the skeleton also retained the uniqueness of the individual, or represented the uniqueness of the individual. And it was surprising. You know, we had done it a year before with just 4 femurs as a test run. And it was like, oh my gosh, not only are the 2 femurs unique, you know, but then you compare it to the next body. And I was like, oh, I have to do this to the whole skeleton. And now I'm committed to that process and repeating it because it's like, how did I miss that after 25 years that I didn't?
Big stuff like organs on other sides, right? We're not just talking about slightly longer tibias or something like. We're just like
no, we're talking about shape, you know, and that human shape. We are an amazing creature in that we really have very different shapes. And the idea that any one shape is representative of the human form, or one shape is the healthy version of the human form, is quite ridiculous and even offensive to me, because really the variation is the human thing, and that the human body, if we would stop thinking of it as our own body, but that the human body is all the bodies. You know, the human species has a body, and that we can extend our concept to include the larger human form and consider all the individual representations of it legitimate expressions of the larger, writ large human body. And my whole idea about what is a body is really transformed over the decades to be much more inclusive.
And that's a wonderful idea, isn't it? It can be extended, like variation as itself, the human thing. It's good. Perhaps there are people on the political left and the political right. It's good.
Absolutely, it's what makes the planet turn. Yeah. And when you start to dogmatize and specify as if one could be right, you're really practicing some strange religion then that I don't want to be a part of. You know, when in fact we have this literally the disequilibrium is what makes us walk. The disequilibrium is what makes things go. If we don't have some disequilibrium amongst us, it would really be very flat. I remember actually it was a British comedian doing this whole bit in some movie I was watching, and he was playing the devil, and he was in this cute little suit, very 1970s, and he was basically saying, why would I want to go to heaven? So boring. Everybody all the same, playing their little instruments and worshiping, you know, and I just got a kick out of that. I was like, yeah, we need our differences, and we need a little bit of conflict actually to progress as a species. If there's no tension, there's no progress.
The unstable ape. And as you say, the variety is the thing. And